Ball State Library of Explication Tapes. The following discussion of literature is one of a series made possible through a Lilly Endowment grant. The award was made by the Committee on Foundation Grants of the Association of College and Research Libraries, a division of the American Library Association. These grants are for the purpose of promoting more extensive and imaginative use of library resources by undergraduate students. Unless otherwise specified, the panelists are members of the English Department of Ball State Teachers College. 4 poems by John Keats. Discussing these poems are Professor Jean Andrews, Professor Alfred Marks, and Professor Ethel-Mae Haave.
Ode on a Grecian Urn. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme, what leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape of deities or mortals, or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens love? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pikes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit, ditties of no tone. Fair youth beneath the trees, thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal. Yet do not grieve, she cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss. Forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Ah, happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu. And happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs, forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young, all breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadest thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What little town by river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of its folk this pious morn? And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can e'er return. O Attic shape, fair attitude, with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed, thou, silent form, dost tease us out of thought as doth eternity. Cold pastoral, when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain, in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know.
Then we notice in the first stanza that we are addressing the urn here directly. We are speaking to it and referring to it as thou still unravished bride of quietness. What is the background, then, of this urn? What do we know about the urn that is being addressed? Where does it come from? Dr. Andrews.
Well, as a matter of fact, we don't know specifically what or any particular urn that Keats had in mind as the subject of this poem. It may be purely an imaginary urn, or more likely a sort of composite of a number of urns that Keats had seen. But I'm not sure that's exactly what you meant by your question. In the poem itself, the urn appears to be a Grecian urn which has lain in the earth for centuries and centuries, and which has been recovered intact, apparently, its beauty still preserved, and it is such an urn that Keats is here addressing. When he calls it an unravished bride of quietness, I think he means that the urn has lain in the earth for years and years, and that its beauty, its purity have not been destroyed by time.
That would be supported also by the fact that he can describe very specifically what the illustrations are.
Yes, I think that in the third line of this poem, too, when he calls it a sylvan historian, that is, a historian of a woodland setting, he pays a tribute to Greek art when he says that the pictures on this urn can express this story more sweetly than his rhyme can do, which turns out to be a case of great modesty on the part of Keats, since this is a poem that is regarded by many as one of the greatest poems that's been written in the English language.
In the second line, he addresses the urn as, "Thou foster child of silence and slow time," underscoring what he said in the first line about the bride being the unravished bride of quietness. He is telling here, then, somewhat about the family of the urn. Here he brings up the fact that its parents, or its foster parents, who have taken care of it since the time that it was made, presumably the parent or the person of whom the urn is the child, not the foster child, is the sculptor or the man who made it originally. And now, or since the death of that sculptor, or since the urn was buried, silence and slow time have been its parents and have somehow guarded it until the time when it was dug up and then, after a time, viewed by the poet.
In this first stanza, I think it's interesting that Keats gives us what we might call a panoramic view of the pictures on this, on the urn itself. He puts this in the form of a question. Again, he's apostrophizing the urn. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape of deities or mortals, or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? That is, he cannot be sure from looking at the picture whether the beings represented in the picture are deities or mortals, or whether some are deities and some are mortals. Tempe and Arcady, of course, are conventional names in pastoral literature for regions in Greece. What men or gods are these? What maidens loth? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? That is, in this first stanza, Keats alludes, I believe, to every picture that is painted on this urn. to give us a preview of coming attractions.
The Dales of Arcady, I'd like to underscore. Arcady, or Arcadia, is the site of pastoral myth, of myth which is concerned with shepherds and the kind of things that they dream about, a world ruled by the god Pan, who plays upon his pipes music to which the women folk of Arcadia, the nymphs, dance, and music which seems to attract them to come out and make themselves available for dancing and love to the shepherds. Arcadia is also peopled by satyrs. I suppose you'd say of satyrs that they are the Arcadian equivalent of the American or the modern wolf. The dryads and hamadryads and many other people there. And Arcadia is the shepherd's world, or the place in which the shepherd's world comes very close to mixing with the world of the supernatural, the world of the gods. And this is why the use of the Dales of Arcady is fairly apt here.
But Tempe was the valley sacred to Apollo, wasn't it, by Mount Olympus? And I wondered, since you said these were conventional and pastoral poetry, whether Keats was using such references as a convention, or whether he was conscious of all the implications, particularly, for example, those of Arcadia, as Dr. Marks mentioned.
I had always interpreted these as being simply conventional references. Keats, one of the things that fascinates Keats about this urn is that it challenges his imagination. He doesn't know the whole story, so that when he tries to supply a specific locale, he's forced to deal in generalizations. He doesn't know whether this action takes place in Tempe or whether it takes place in Arcady. He doesn't know whether these beings represented on the urn are deities or mortals. And these questions that he asks, I think, build up in intensity until the final line, what wild ecstasy. Keats is viewing this urn with the same feeling of awe and amazement. He experiences the same challenge to his imagination that I think we find in his sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, for instance.
I have thought a good deal about these question marks, and I wonder if they emphasize something that is unknown in the poet's mind, or whether they are rhetorical questions and are used then in connection with the mood of apostrophe that the poem starts out with. This direct address of the urn, referring to it as the unravished bride of quietness, foster child of silence and slow time, and then this question of what things do you about about your shape? What kind of stories happen there? Something like what sometimes happens with my children. They will come up to me and say, why did so-and-so make that statement? Meaning some funny story lies behind the statement that the man made. Really, they don't want to know why the man made this statement. They want the whole story repeated. And I wonder if this isn't what Keats is doing here, asking this question rhetorically because he wants to discuss the content of these pictures around the urn?
Well, the objection, I think, to such an interpretation is that some of these questions are not answered, and that he continues this method of interrogating the urn in other stanzas in the poem, when he asks, for instance, to what altar is the priest leading the heifer? In short, the questions on this urn suggest a story, but they don't tell a story. They only suggest one. If he sees a young man chasing a maiden, a story may be suggested to Keats, but obviously a picture, a group of still pictures on different subjects, cannot really tell a story. I think in connection with this fact that the pictures are on different subjects, one critic has pointed out that this perhaps is a dead giveaway to the fact that Keats was not basing this poem upon any real Grecian urn that he had seen, because this would be that is, there never was any such Grecian urn. It would be a violation of the Grecian principle of classic simplicity to have all of these different pictures on different subjects painted on the same urn. The Grecian artist would be more likely to paint one classically simple picture on the urn itself.
I was thinking primarily of the questions in stanza 1, so that we notice that he takes a fairly consistent interpretation of what the answers to his questions are in the rest of the poem. He assumes that these pictures are of mortals, but that they are in some region like the dales of Arcady. They are living some joyful life like that of the shepherds in Arcady, and he uses the term cold pastoral at the end, and advisedly in this connection. He talks about maidens loath and maidens willing, and mad pursuit and struggle to escape, and pipes and timbrels, wild ecstasy. All of these things that he asks about are pictured rather explicitly in the rest of the poem. So he does, I believe, assume an interpretation of what the answers to his questions are going to be.
Yes, he does decide, doesn't he?
Somewhat as we do in techniques in discussing a poem of this kind. Very frequently we ask questions which we propose to answer ourselves when we get the topic back again. I think Keats is doing here by asking these questions in this first stanza.
Well, I wonder then if we might not say that he is using the same basic technique that we find sometimes used in modern fiction. The story that comes to my mind most immediately is Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton, in which we have a narrator telling a story in which he relates events, very detailed events, that he couldn't possibly know firsthand. And it becomes evident that what he is doing is giving us the story as he has reconstructed it from the scraps of information that he's picked up. And I think we might say that Keats is doing the same thing here. He does attempt to draw some conclusions as to what is supposed to be taking place in these pictures, but I think at best we can say that we are getting a reconstructed version of the story as it actually happened.
Yes, then the line, or the lines, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme, since they are followed by the questions here, mean that the urn can express this flowery tale so much more sweetly because of the air of mystery about the things that it seems to tell, and because the mind of the person who beholds the urn has to supply so many things that could never be put down, and that could never be put down explicitly, that in doing so, the imagination constructs something much greater than words can ever express.
Or would it be all right to say that Keats is more interested in his reaction than in the precise truth of these illustrations, and his reaction is the more intense because he is unable or unwilling to examine the illustrations carefully and settle the factual truth?
And therefore, in a way, his own poem is something that is limited. As soon as he puts pen to paper, he must limit his interpretation of what happens on the urn. And therefore, the Sylvan historian can express this tale much more sweetly than he.
That is, the artist's most effective weapon then is the reader's imagination. In this poem, or we might say the painter's most effective weapon is the reader's imagination. That is what the painting suggests to him. Of course, this entire discussion, I think, leads us on into the next stanza where we have this theme developed more explicitly. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. What kind of melody, Dr. Haave, is an unheard melody?
Well, it's a nice paradox, of course. I suppose, putting it very prosaically, one could say that the heard melody perhaps has some small errors, but the ideal one does not. And of course, it is simply paradoxical, the one that your imagination may present to you, as opposed to the faulty reality.
Yes, and of course, I think this idea of finite limitations also, even if the heard melody is free of obvious flaws.
Of course, it never would be.
Yes, but even if it were free of obvious flaws, nevertheless, I think we find in this poem this idea that the possibilities of art are infinite. The actual accomplishment of artists is quite finite.
Yes, he is complementary to the heard melodies, not derogatory in any way, but the ideal, the one that the imagination can present to the musician, is more than the musician can accomplish. And of course, the unheard heard is a beautiful paradox.
This is an interesting problem in the Romantic poets and in Romantic thinkers in general, that the imagination can find so much more truth than the mundane mind can, simply adding up a number of figures or judging by what it sees or hears. And we have many haunting stories and haunting poems about the kind of melody that exists somewhere at the fringes of one's memory or of one's mind, melodies that one has never heard, or perhaps, as in the poem The Lost Chord, the sound, the music that one heard for only an instant and then was never able to reassemble. There is a poem by John Masefield entitled On Growing Old, in which we have the line, "The wind moves a thin ghost of music in the spinet." The Romantic poets, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, were all interested in the wind harp, which could be placed on a windowsill and which would produce a rather eerie music when the wind would move through it. The story Death in the Woods by Sherwood Anderson states the problem of the writer picking up certain evidence for a story and certain basic meanings in life as if it was music heard from far off, of which he had to pick up the notes one at a time. And here we have then a unheard melodies, or perhaps, as I have extended it to mean, music which is rather undistinctly heard, as appealing very strongly to the imagination and as giving one insight on basic truth. And this is related to the words, pipe to the spirit, ditties of no tone. There is then, in this music that is unheard, a kind of spiritual music which enables one to have a more direct insight of certain ideas and certain happenings beyond the realm of the here and now.
The rest of the stanza, however, somewhat changes the emphasis, whereas the unheard melodies are sweeter. The next element, the fairy youth, however, although he does not have the intensity of actual action, has the eternality of his present place.
And it's interesting to notice then that we have a colon after the word tone, because this is going to document the problem that he has been talking about.
Yes, the youth is apparently just on the verge of kissing the maiden. I think we also find this implication here that that anticipation, or the joy that the imagination can provide, is going to be much greater than the actual realization of that joy. Although Keats doesn't emphasize this idea, I see in this poem the implication that the youth would be disappointed if he actually kissed the maiden. This is a theme which we find brought out in some of Keats' other poetry. The fact that there's something sad about our greatest moments of ecstasy. But I think here, just as we would be disappointed if we could actually hear the music from the pipes, so the youth would actually be disappointed if he actually achieved his goal of kissing the maiden. Of course, Keats's emphasis is upon the fact that his state of being just about to kiss the maiden is eternal, that the maiden will always remain beautiful, that he will always be in love with that maiden.
Yes, this is very important here, that time does not control what happens on the urn. He used the term back a while that the urn was the foster child of silence and slow time. Here, time is actually stopped, and the trees cannot be bare. The youth can never stop singing, and maybe he's becoming tired of his song, but at the same time, what a wonderful fate this seems to Keats to be, to always be able to sing. And while it may seem to be difficult that the youth, the lover, cannot kiss the maiden, nevertheless, how wonderful it is, what a wonderful compensation it is for the fact that she will always be beautiful and his love will always be warm and youthful.
Yes, we find here that we've worked into an interesting little transition. Keats started off this stanza with the idea that the imagination could provide a greater joy than reality could actually supply. By the time we get to the end of this stanza, we discover that the theme has shifted slightly. Now he's not just talking about the superiority of the imagination. He's talking about the eternal quality of art. And it is on this note that he picks up the theme in the next stanza, the one beginning, "Ah, happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu." and happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. I was interested in your comment, your parenthetical comment, Dr. Marks, that the youth might get tired of singing the same song over again. You see, this is the virtue of art, that the song that the youth is singing is not the same song that he was singing 5 minutes ago. It is constantly, it's not a constantly changing song, but it is at least a song that is always new. It is never being repeated, but each time that this same song is piped, it is new.
I don't know why that would be, unless it might apply to each successive viewer of the urn, but we have to be very careful in moving out into this area, lest we convey the impression that we believe that the meaning of a poem can be different depending upon the number of people who read it. And I think that there is a certain obvious common area in which all educated readers should get a very similar idea about what the poem, at least, says.
Well, then it would mean that in this world of stopped time, he is able to approach each rendition of the song with the same imaginative interest as he did the first time.
Yes, I think that's very beautifully stated.
Well, I think the point is that this is the first time. This is the first time, and it'll always
in this world
be the
of
first
eternity.
time. Yes.
And this is the important quality, then, that this is a timeless happening, and that in this timeless area, the boughs are not only happy because things are timeless. Once having been happy on the urn, the boughs must continue to be happy for as long as the urn exists.
Yes, and I think the reference to love here is interesting. I don't know that it's necessary to explore the possibility of autobiographical reference. It may be that Keats is alluding here to his own rather unhappy love for Fanny Brawne. I'm not at all sure that it's necessary to bring this into the poem, but he again rejoices that in this world of arrested time, love is always at its height, that the artist has captured the love of this man and woman at its peak, and that it will not, as mortal love so often does, become cloyed.
If he were then to kiss the girl, that would be past the peak in Keats' point of view?
Yes, I think so. Everything afterwards would be an anticlimax. Notice also that this is a rather ideal love. It is far above all breathing human passion. Keats, I think, regards the lovers on this urn as living, of course, in a sort of never-never land, in which they will never be tortured by the pains of unrequited love. They will never become high sorrowful and cloyed with love. They will never suffer from the burning forehead and the parching tongue.
I'm very interested in these lines because they exemplify to me what I see rather often in Keats. So many people are apt to take Keats as being the dead, serious man who is so concerned with the life of art and the life of the poetic image, and who shrieks at times in excitement over what he might hear. And here I feel that Keats is discussing love in these terms with some amusement. This is the picture that we have here of the lover is very similar to the lover in the All the World's a Stage passage in as you like it. I've forgotten exactly how the line goes. Do either of you Shakespearean scholars recall about the lover here who makes up poems and addresses these to his mistress's eyebrow? And I've forgotten the rest of the line. But here, where he talks about this love which leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue, this is the kind of lover who in the Romantic period was so carried away by his love that he left tears on the letters which he sent to his lover. And some lovers, in fact the lovers in Emma Bovary, and this was Emma Bovary's difficulty in Madame Bovary, she wanted her lovers to love in this way. One of her lovers sent her letters on which he had sprinkled water to create the impression that he had been sighing and crying over a letter that he was sending to her. I believe here that Keats is deliberately exaggerating this point.
Well, I suppose a little while ago I said that I didn't think it was necessary to bring in the autobiographical element. I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring it in here, though. If one reads the letters that Keats wrote to Fanny Brown, I think you can see the same sort of tortured lover reflected in those letters that Keats is describing here. That is, Keats apparently loved with a passionate intensity that resulted in his suffering. And Fanny Brown appears to have been a little bit bewildered by the whole affair and incapable of returning any such intense passion for Keats. And the result, of course, was that Keats found himself frustrated and unhappy. But although perhaps the description in this third stanza is slightly exaggerated, I think that it's so near it comes so near to describing Keats's actual condition at times that I find it difficult to believe that it was intended in a humorous fashion.
It seemed to me that this passage was quite in keeping with the Romantic tradition of love as being tragic and causing suffering.
And causing fevers and even a certain parching of the tongue.
But meant seriously here, not satirically or as amusingly.
Well, we move then to stanza 4, and now we return to our questions. Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadst thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What do we get a picture of here, Dr. Andrews?
Apparently this is a pagan sacrifice of some sort, possibly a sacrifice at some fertility festival of some sort. Again, Keats only asks the question and doesn't answer it very specifically. We gather that on this urn is painted a picture of a procession, perhaps led by a priest, who is taking a heifer decorated with flowers to the altar to sacrifice to some god.
Could one say that Keats returned to the description of the Grecian urn because his commentary, his reflections above, were getting a bit painful?
Yes, I think that's a possibility. We do discover that Keats, and I think this is an interesting point in the poem, that Keats appears to have moved right into the life on the urn, starting in with stanza 2. He starts off in stanza 1, standing away from the urn and looking at it comparatively objectively. In stanza 2, he seems to move right into the urn to assume that these creatures and human beings painted on the urn are are real living creatures with a life of their own. And I think probably in the last part of the third stanza, he does begin to comment or editorialize upon what he has seen. And here in the fourth stanza, he moves back to the actual content.
Back very suddenly.
Yes, shifts back to the actual content of the picture on the urn again.
Well, I think we can certainly say that stanza 1 sets up the problem. Stanza 2 points to a particular thing that is happening on the urn and a particular truth in connection with the figures on the urn. Stanza 3 compares the truth that applies to the people on the urn with the truth of people not on the urn, of life. So there is this comparison or contrast in stanza 3, which can be carried as far as one wants to take it.
Yes, and in stanza 4, it's rather interesting that Keats not only is within the life represented on the urn, but he even begins to extend it. Here, as I understand it, the little town by river or seashore is not represented on the urn at all. The mere fact that he's not sure whether it's by a river or by a seashore or whether it's built on a mountain with a peaceful citadel indicates that this picture is not represented on the urn itself. How does it get into the poem then, Dr. Marks?
This is one of my favorite little problems in poetry, and it exemplifies for me this problem that he is mentioning above about the unheard melodies being sweeter. This is something then not only that is not heard, but is not even seen. From the picture that he has on the urn, he gets the evidence that some little town has been emptied of its people. Or let us say, from seeing these people here for this sacrifice, he assumes that they come from somewhere. He then assumes that they are most of the residents of some little town that is now empty, and then moves from thinking about the urn in front of him to moving about this empty town, or to thinking about this empty town. And then he thinks of the town and says, little town, you must be empty now as you were then, and you will always be empty, because the people who once populated you, who once lived in your homes, have now been taken and placed immutably and eternally on this urn in this everlasting work of art, which I know has existed for several millennia at least. So there's this interesting point, this jump into presuming on something which has never existed and which exists only in the world of art, and then making logical inferences on what the life of this art construct is.
I think in the last stanza of the poem we find Keats re-emerging from this world of the imagination. No longer is he in the life that is represented in the pictures on the urn, but in the last stanza I think we discover that he is now once again standing off, looking at the urn as a whole.
4 poems by John Keats. Discussing these poems are Professor Jean Andrews, Professor Alfred Marks, and Professor Ethel-Mae Haave.
He returns to the direct apostrophe of the urn itself and speaks of some of the physical characteristics of this urn, reminding us that the story that is implied is a story that is implied by pictures only. And he speaks of such things as the border of the urn, with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought. So that now it's clearer that the poet has come back to reality to some extent, that he's no longer in this world of the imagination, and is addressing the urn directly. Notice that I think we have a return to this theme of the power of the imagination again in the 4th line of the poem, of the stanza, thou silent form dost tease us out of thought as doth eternity. This, of course, describes exactly what has been going on in this poem. That is, the poet has been teased out of his thoughts to the extent that he has become concerned over a town which is not even represented on the urn.
And he says, doth tease us out of thought as doth eternity, meaning that there is some similarity between the contemplation of the timeless and the timeful, the infinitude in time.
Yes, I think it's quite common to find that it takes a pretty wise philosopher who is able to contemplate eternity with complete equanimity. And as you suggest, Keats finds that it takes the same sort of deep thought in order to attempt to understand anything that is completely arrested in time.
And perhaps one ought to make it utterly clear and say tease us out of thought means a thought about his personal life or concerns, because he is thinking throughout the poem.
I wonder, however, if the tease us out of thought doesn't exemplify primarily what happens to him in stanza 4, where the teasing that happens to him carries his mind beyond the logical. And whether tease us out of thought doesn't mean to tease you to make inferences
I find nothing illogical in the poem.
Well, I think that in this, that the comparison with eternity suggests what one might call coming up against a stone wall. That is, whenever anyone attempts to conceive of eternal space or eternal time, he finally has to give up in despair because there is no end. There are no limits to such a conception, and mankind necessarily has to think in terms of the finite. And just as mankind is unable to conceive of the infinite in space and the infinite in time, it seems to me that Keats is unable to conceive of the infinite in implication, which is what he's been dealing with in this poem. A picture which has an infinite story implied.
I wonder if the adjective marble, as applied to marble men here, is, beside its denotation of men and women who are here fixed in glaze, whether it also refers to the contrast between the men on the urn and the men who have hearts high sorrowful and cloyed and burning foreheads and parching tongues, whether the marble men means men who are able to brave the difficulties of love and bear these difficulties without becoming so terribly upset by them. Strong men, in other words.
The use of marble men and maidens seems to be supported by the phrase cold pastoral. I've always wondered whether these terms could be being employed in an ironical sense. Cold appears to mean lifeless, and when Keats calls this urn a cold pastoral in the sense of being a lifeless pastoral, he seems to be contradicting everything that he's been saying up to this point.
The cold pastoral, then, may set up an interesting contrast between the life on the urn and the life of men. It may then mean or express a kind of envy that Keats, the lover, feels here. This envy of these men on the urn who can live the pastoral life, the joy, carefree life of the urn, or of Arcadian times or bucolic times, without suffering the consequences, without suffering all the pains that come from that life. And so they are able to enjoy themselves rather coldly, without being consumed by these things. And it then sets up an interesting contrast between the burning forehead and the parching tongue of the human being and the coldness of the marble men on the urn.
Yes, certainly there is intended to, this point, I think, is largely about the contrast between the world of the imagination and the physical world that we live in. And this is it's on this note that the poem closes: when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. Here again he is addressing the urn. The urn will remain even after this present generation of human beings has been wasted by time, and will remain a friend to man, to whom the urn will give this message: beauty is truth, truth beauty. Now, the meaning of this last speech of the urn is one that's been debated rather extensively among scholars. In one sense, there's a possibility that Keats may be talking here about artistic beauty. That is, he may be saying that very much the same thing that Shakespeare says in Hamlet's advice to the players, that the end of art is to hold the mirror up to nature, and that the artist who succeeds in representing what he sees truthfully has created beauty. Do you get any other meaning from this poem, from this line?
I like to think that the word truth here means that which will not change. It is sometimes interesting to notice the confusion in the minds of undergraduates about the word truth. The word truth to them has always meant something that can be applied to the words of the young George Washington. They don't think of truth as being some abstract precept by which a person may live and which will never alter, which will always be useful to him regardless of the difficulties of life. So I'd like to look at truth here as being that which does not change, as the urn does not change, and as the life of the marble men and women on the urn does not change, so beauty becomes something which can always provide a release, can always provide joy, and no matter how many times you come to the beautiful object, the same sense of joy can be found there because it does not change. So essentially, beauty here perhaps can be restricted to mean artistic beauty.
Yes, I would think it would have to be restricted to artistic beauty. That is, beauty in an art form is truth, because if you think of beauty as representing something that is eternal, well, standards of beauty have changed, certainly, over the course of generations, over the course of centuries. But beauty in an art form is truth. That is, beauty that reproduces, holds a mirror up to nature is truth, and the reverse, of course. And I think you have to insert in artistic form or in art form after beauty to make the quotation sensible.
Of course, there's at least one other possibility. There are actually a number of possibilities that we might examine. One other leading interpretation, however, is based principally, I believe, upon one of Keats's letters, in which he says, "What the imagination seizes as beauty must be the truth. The imagination may be compared to Adam's dream. He awoke and found it truth." Now, this line from his letter seems to indicate that perhaps the quotation from the Ode on the Grecian Urn, "Beauty is truth, truth, beauty," is an affirmation of the Romantics' faith in intuition. We find such poets as Wordsworth, for instance, maintaining that what the child instinctively or intuitively knows frequently represents greater wisdom than what our philosophers discover by dint of long years of study. That is, what the imagination regards as beauty, Keats says, is truth, is eternal in that sense.
He then goes on to say, "That is all you know on earth and all you need to know," meaning that from beauty, from art, you can find a way to build your life and a way to live your life in the future. And that if you simply understand that the fountainhead of all ethics that last and of ways toward life that will not delude you lie in beauty, in art, you will be a happy man on earth and a man who will avoid many of life's difficulties.
Of course, there's one problem that I think we should at least mention, and this is the rather abrupt shift in point of view that we have in the last few lines of this poem. The quotation marks in most modern texts of the Ode on a Grecian Urn close after "Beauty is truth, truth, beauty." And the concluding remark, "That is all you know on earth and all you need to know," is not enclosed in quotation marks at all. With this punctuation, then, we appear to have the poet turning to the reader in the last line of the poem and addressing the reader, that is, the people of this world, directly. Many critics have regarded this as a flaw in the poem, although in fairness to Keats, I think we should point out that that the punctuation of this poem is still very much up in the air and in dispute. Some editors prefer to include the entire last two lines within the quotation marks, which gives us then the urn saying to man, Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know, which in many respects, I think, makes a better reading.
If you want to avoid the belief that Keats would not have committed the heresy of the didactic, actually, I think he could very well have pointed it out in this fashion. The Romantic poets were extremely didactic, were quite interested in making it clear what they were teaching. And in Ode to Autumn, Keats makes it clear in the middle of the poem that he is telling an autumn poem here, and that he is glorifying autumn and not spring, and tries to make it clear that autumn has its songs just as spring has its songs, and that they can be quite beautiful. But I think it's quite useful that you expressed both points of view that can be given with a shift in the quotation marks, and I think we should simply say here that this is a question that we can argue and argue about, but that it will not be settled until the doubtful day that we find a manuscript in Keats's handwriting in which he unequivocally says, "I wanted the quotation marks here and not there."
Yes, I think actually there's about as much editorial evidence to support one reading as there is to support the other. Aside from the point of view, however, the message is one that has been debated widely, and I would say that this is one of those instances in which the area of interpretation that most intelligent readers should find themselves able to work within is a very broad area indeed.
We should make it clear, then, that this poem has had books, many books, thousands and probably millions of words written about it, and that we are essentially trying to find a path through it that will be useful to the undergraduate, and that will help him to get meanings on which he can build his own scholarly interpretations.
To Autumn, season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers. And sometimes, like a gleaner, thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press, with patient look, thou watchest the last oozings, hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too. While barred clouds bloom the soft dying day and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue, then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. And full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft, the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. Dr. Marks, perhaps you would care to explain to us who is speaking in this poem and to whom he is speaking.
I think we can say safely that this is the poet that is speaking. We aren't given any specific statement as to who is talking, but he is addressing autumn, quite directly addressing autumn. In fact, addressing autumn in terms that come very close to being apostrophe, to holding something up high and declaiming on the merits of that thing. So he says of autumn, season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. In this direct address of autumn, we don't have the second person you given, but we might well say that he is saying here, you, season of mists and mellow fruitfulness.
Dr. Haave, do you think that Keats has in mind here a particular setting or scene?
No, I would not say that the poet has a particular setting or scene. Probably, if you look at the first stanza, a few of the references, thatch eaves, mossed cottage trees, suggest, I suppose, rural England. They, I suppose, are in sections of the city not touched particularly by shingles, and it is a general place in which the autumn comes in a very luxurious fashion indeed. Perhaps this is a synthesis of a lovely farm in England, could be France, of course. It does not seem to be the United States, but beyond that, it doesn't really matter where it takes place, I would say.
Yes, in this first stanza of the poem, it seems to me that Keats selects one particular aspect of autumn to write about, and I would say that this aspect is ripeness, or to use Keats's word, fruitfulness. I think this stanza is also an interesting, or provides an interesting example of how sometimes poets are able quite effectively to reinforce the sense of their poetry with the sound of the poetry. For instance, I think here the poet has used quite liberally L's and R's, the liquid sounds of the language, in order to reinforce this idea of ripeness or roundness. Now, of course, this isn't to say that every time a poet uses an L or an R, he intends for us to get the idea of ripeness or roundness. But I would say still that in this context, the sounds reinforce the sense. For instance, in this passage, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees until they think warm days will never cease, and so on. Notice the words here that are characterized by the L and R sounds.
We have
Apples.
then an emphasis on the liquid consonants.
Yes, I think it's, we can't dismiss this entirely as accident because of the preponderance of L's and R sounds. Apples, trees, fill, all, fruit, ripeness, core, swell, gourd, plump, hazel, shells, kernel, more, still more, later, and so on.
And it's interesting to notice that of these words, as you use them, they are either images like the hazelnut or the shells or the kernels or the fruit, words that are associated with autumn, or they are words that are associated with the plenitude of autumn, words like more and still more and fill are also basic words associated with autumn. The imagery of Keats is, of course, a basic problem, and the word imagery again and again is the word that one recurs to in discussing Keats. In connection with the imagery, can we look first at the personification? In what way is the autumn personified in this first stanza?
I'm not sure that we get a very clear personification in the first stanza. It seems to me that the clear personification is postponed until the second stanza. What do you see in the first stanza that leads us to?
Do you mean the friend of the sun in that respect?
Yes, the specific pointing out of the autumn as a friend of the sun, which then somehow helps the sun in this business of loading and blessing the vines with fruit. I don't know whether the sun here is pictured as a priest who blesses the vines with fruit or not, and the autumn then is a kind of acolyte who walks with the priest. At any rate, autumn does these things with the sun, conspires how to load and bless with fruit the vines, how to bend with apples the moss cottage trees, and fill all the fruit with ripeness in the core, to swell the gourd, and plump the hazel shells, and do all of these things.
Well, it seems to me that probably the friend of the sun in stanza 1 is retained only in the back of the mind until you do get to the insistence of the personification in stanza 2. Otherwise, the imagery in stanza 1 is predominantly, I think, visual, a description of general exterior autumn.
Of course, I think no discussion of Keats would be complete without mentioning his sensuousness, his appeal to the senses, and in stanza 1, I think we have plenty of that. We have appeal not only to the eye, but in a rather indirect way, I think, to the sense of taste also. The mention of fruit and the rather oblique reference to honey in the final line of that stanza, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. These are the clammy cells of the bees. And we discover that honey is one of Keats's favorite foods, apparently. He uses honey for purposes of comparison in any number of different poems. The Eve of St. Agnes, of course, is the one that comes to mind most immediately.
The only specific appeal, however, to taste is the word sweet here. Isn't that correct?
Wouldn't you say that ripeness actually is at least an indirect appeal to the
indirect,
sense of taste?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
There is also here again the problem of plenitude. We usually think of the cornucopia as being the basic image of the autumn. And this stanza is just filled with images which are overfilled, so that the vines become loaded with fruit. The mossed cottage trees become bent with apples. The fruit is filled with ripeness to the very core, and the gourd is swelled so fat, and even the hazel shells are fat. Now, I don't know, usually I think of the hazelnut as being a nut inside which the nut rattles. Now, I may not have ever come in contact with really ripe hazelnuts. That may be what's wrong with me.
I think so, yes.
Then to set budding more and still more the later flowers for the bees, and finally the bees are already so filled up with honey that they don't have room for more. To use a business administration adjective, or expression, their inventory is much greater than they want it to be, and yet the autumn is still bringing more and more flowers for them. I just wanted to bring up that point of plenitude which he combines with the imagery of autumn to give this additional dimension to this stanza.
I think our personification becomes more specific, however, in our second stanza. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind. How does autumn appear to be personified here?
Well, it's certainly a woman sitting like some nymph here, quietly on the granary floor.
What makes you say that she's a woman? I think, if my memory serves me correctly, classically, autumn is personified as a man. What evidence do you have that Keats's personification is that of a woman?
Only the fact that she seems to have a lot of hair.
Thy hair soft lifted, yes.
That is not very good evidence, I'll admit. Shepherds in most classical settings that I've seen have rather long hair. However, I find it difficult to think that a man would dwell lingeringly on the way the hair is lifted by the breeze if it were a man whom he was talking about.
Possibly, too, one is led to that supposition by the fact that the personification autumn here shows no great sign of endeavor. That is, the drowsiness is symbolized here.
Yes, I think that, as a matter of fact, I would say that the second stanza here deals with the drowsiness and pensiveness or pensive atmosphere of autumn. I think it is characteristic of Keats that most of his images are static images. It's been pointed out, for instance, that some of our great writers, Shakespeare, for instance, commonly employs images that are connected with motion of some sort, so that Shakespeare's images tend to be moving all the time. I think that when we examine Keats, we discover that he uses static images that are of things that are in repose, and I think that this is a good example. Autumn is personified then as a woman who is carelessly sitting on a granary floor or half asleep somewhere else.
That may be. It is certainly true that in the last stanza, let us say, the images that move, like fill or swell or set budding or round the thatch eaves run, that these verbs are not really images, but they're fairly denotative in their meaning. However, we have the adjective in the fourth line of the second stanza, winnowing, which again I like to bring up because it shows his ability, Keats' ability to use image after image that is directly in line with the kind of thing that he's talking about. And here he uses the term winnowing, meaning, as I understand it, the process that follows the process of flailing the grain. The threshing process, as we know it, is a process of flailing and winnowing, when you separate the grain from the chaff. And here he uses a harvest image for winnowing, but this to me is a moving image and not a static image.
No, I would certainly was generalizing here. I think it is true, however, that we'll discover that even Keats's images which involve motion are likely to involve either ponderous motion or lazy motion, but they seldom involved swift or violent action.
Well, there's another bit here. Steady thy laden head across a brook. The action there is certainly very gentle, not exactly ponderous, but dignified.
Yes.
Yes, I'll admit that your point is a good one, but I think in treating it, we should bring up objections to it if we can, and see if it will stand.
Well, it also strikes me that the second stanza, beside personifying autumn, serves to brief one upon the various occupations of autumn. The first stanza deals with visual imagery, the second stanza with occupations, although I admit these occupations are not pursued with much ardor here.
Yes, and of course we do find in the second stanza also the image of drowsiness, which appears to be a favorite one with Keats, as we'll see when we get to the Ode to a Nightingale. Autumn may be drowsed with the fume of poppies and consequently almost half asleep.
Yes, I think that the occupations are quite interesting here. First, the cutter, autumn, with the hook, or actually the scythe, or perhaps a sickle. Then, like a gleaner that picks up the grain that has been cut and presumably places it in a shock, and the gleaner is then walking with this grain on his head. And then finally, the group around a cider press, perhaps one feeding apples into the cider press and watching there the last oozings, hours by hours, of the cider. And again, we have the same sense again of the plenitude of autumn, and watching even these last oozings of life and of the lovely wine of autumn, the cider, being pressed out into the press is emphasized.
As I would consider this last image that we have, the oozings of the last drops from the cider press, as being a typical image of Keats. Yes, it involves motion, but it's very slow, languid motion.
There is then, speaking of slow, languid motion, in the fifth line of the second stanza, the drowse with the fume of poppies is an allusion to one of the favorite themes of the Romantic poets, of whom Keats was one, and that is the theme of opium, or the use of narcotics like opium. Coleridge, we know, was, the kindest word we can say is accustomed to using opium through fairly regular doses of laudanum, and we understand that Kubla Khan was written in an opium trance. There is the book by De Quincey, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, and also familiar are the number of references to opium that are made in the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe, a man writing a little later than the English Romantic poets in the United States.
What seems remarkable about this stanza, too, that although the sun is not mentioned, yet because of the effect upon autumn, one gets the impression of a very hot day with a very slight breeze, although, again, as I said, the quality of heat isn't mentioned. You see it by the effect. I think that's rather skillfully done here indeed. Everything is slowed down. There's an overpowering impulse simply to sleep, to lose oneself in the sun, rather than to carry on these various occupations.
I think that perhaps at this time it might be well to point out that so far in the poem, at least, we have had pictorial poetry and nothing else. That is, and I think probably Dr. Haave may disagree with me at some point along the line here, but I believe that To Autumn, certainly more than any of the other great odes by Keats, has an emphasis upon itself and Keats does not go outside of the description itself in order to philosophize about anything, as we will discover he does in Ode to a Nightingale or Ode on a Grecian Urn. Certainly, if there is any outside philosophizing, it is not to be found in these first two stanzas.
Unless you have a hint of it in those words, "Thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours." And as I said, there has been this emphasis on plenitude throughout the first two stanzas, and perhaps there might then be a hint of autumn watching its own season, its own store, come to some kind of end. But that is purely implication. And also, as you mentioned, in the poem, I count strong imagery used in every single line except for these first two lines of stanza 3, which are, "Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too." And these, of course, are transitional lines. Otherwise, however, our imagery is strong in every line.
Yes, I think the first two lines of this third stanza also announce the theme of this stanza. That is, the third stanza of this poem is devoted to what we might call the music of autumn, or more prosaically, simply the sounds of autumn. But as we examine the stanza, I think we'll discover that Keats is thinking of these sounds of autumn as constituting a music.
Yes, so it does indeed. The words, of course, are onomatopoetic words, and there are more of them here, certainly, than in any other stanza. The wailful, the bleat, and whistles, and the gathering swallows twitter in the sky. These are sound words, or onomatopoetic, and it is that kind of sound imagery, of course, is used deliberately in this stanza, it would seem to me.
Yes, we have, of course, an appeal to the visual sense in lines 3 and 4. While borrowed clouds bloom the soft dying day and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. I think bloom here is being used in perhaps a slightly unusual sense. Here, I think he means simply that the light coming through the clouds makes radiant the soft dying day. That is, the light filtered through the clouds produces a sort of rose-colored light and touches the stubble plains with rosy hue. And then against this background of color, then, he begins to build up his orchestration, if you excuse the metaphor. That is, we have the small gnats in a wailful choir. Interestingly enough, this isn't the first mention of the music of the gnats by Keats. In one of his earlier poems, he also uses a similar conceit, if you wish to call it that, of the mournful music that the gnats make. Of course, I think it's interesting that ordinarily we don't think of crickets and gnats and the bleating of lambs as being very mellifluous, but they certainly become so.
Well, they are in evening.
Well, I suppose this is only a matter of taste then. I never had thought of them as being particularly musical, but Keats certainly makes them appear to be so.
And another reason for emphasizing these sounds that are not usually emphasized is, as he tells us in the first two lines, he is singing here songs of autumn, and we are accustomed to having songs sung about the songs of spring.
Yes, the twittering of the robin and so on has been commonly represented as music. Notice here Keats even has divided his orchestration up so that we have the redbreast providing the treble for this massive choir of autumn.
There's a letter that Keats wrote on September 22nd, 1819, in which he says, "How beautiful the season is now, how fine the air, a temperate sharpness about it. Really, without joking, chaste weather, Dian skies. I never liked stubble fields so much as now, aye, better than the chilly green of the spring. Somehow a stubble field looks warm, in the same way that some pictures look warm. This struck me so much in my Sunday's walk that I composed upon it." Interesting there is this business of calling it chaste weather and Dian skies. This may emphasize what I tried to assert about the sex of autumn in the second stanza, but it also emphasizes the opposition that Keats feels as existing between the kind of poem that he is trying to write here and the kind of poem that many people write about spring.
I think we ought to examine somewhat the means of organization that Keats has used in this poem. There are various. One of them is probably that stanza 1 presents an exterior description of nature. Stanza 2 presents the occupations possible in nature. As I think we said before, no one pursues these with great diligence because of the possibly oppressive heat of the afternoon. And stanza 3 presents the sounds of autumn. And then if we look back, there's also a chronology. Indeed, it's a rather complicated chronology. Stanza 1 might be said to be morning, late morning. It's a season of mists. Stanza 2 gives the impression distinctly of being late afternoon, and stanza 3 we move into, obviously, evening. However, there is a second chronological organization. Stanza 1 certainly gives the impression of being mid-autumn, indeed past the peak of autumn. Possibly everything is overripe. And by the time one gets down to the end of stanza 3, the lambs are full grown, the redbreast is whistling, and this seems to be very late autumn indeed, almost toward the approach of winter. And then, though this perhaps cannot be pursued with quite such intensity, stanza 1 begins very close to the cottage, to the house, and then you move gradually away from this inner core out into the natural world. Stanza 2 takes place in the field, somewhat away from the house, and stanza 3 is almost away on the outskirts. The lambs are bleating from the hilly terrain, and in the last line one moves distinctly out in the skies, out into the universe, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies, and you are quite remote from the small core of the beginning of the poem.
We have then, in the poem, a kind of apostrophe to autumn, in which autumn is mentioned in many of her guises. First, that of the friend of the maturing sun. Second, that of the person who brings in the grain from the field and places it in the granary. Next, that of the cutter. And next, that of the gleaner. Finally, that of the person at the cider press. And then there is a shift in stanza 3 to the songs of autumn. There is very little intellectual content, very small attempt to have the imagery exemplify some particular idea in the poet's mind. Nevertheless, there is very effective picturing in spatial terms of the many faces and the many personal guises that are assumed by autumn.
4 poems by John Keats. Discussing these poems are Professor Jean Andrews, Professor Alfred Marks, and Professor Ethel-Mae Haave.
Ode on Melancholy. No, no, go not to Lethe, neither twist wolfbane tight-rooted for its poisonous wine, nor suffer thy pale forehead to be kissed by nightshade, ruby grape of Proserpine. Make not your rosary of yew-berries, nor let the beetle nor the death moth be your mournful Psyche, nor the downy owl a partner in your sorrow's mysteries. For shade to shade will come too drowsily and drown the wakeful anguish of the soul. But when the melancholy fit shall fall sudden from heaven like a weeping cloud that fosters the droop-headed flowers all, and hides the green hill in an April shroud, then glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, or on the rainbow of the salt sand wave, or on the wealth of globed peonies. Or, if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand, and let her rave, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, and joy whose hand is ever at his lips bidding adieu, and aching pleasure nigh, turning to poison while the bee-mouth sips. Aye, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine. His soul shall taste the sadness of her might, and be among her cloudy trophies hung. This subject of melancholy is one which appeared to have different associations in Keats's time than it does today. I think that when Keats thought of melancholy, he also thought of all of the associations that melancholy had for him through his reading in 16th and 17th century literature. In this literature, melancholy is considered a rather desirable characteristic. Probably the most striking example of the desirability of melancholy we find expressed in Milton's Il Penseroso, for instance. We also know that Keats was interested in the anatomy of melancholy by Burton, where also he may have become interested in this subject. But melancholy then was not considered a quality which was to be avoided at all costs, but was considered rather desirable, especially, I think, by the Romantics. Dr. Haave, who does Keats appear to be addressing in the opening lines of this poem?
This particular ode is possibly somewhat different from other of Keats's odes insofar as the ode is not addressed to melancholy. The title says Ode on Melancholy, and the person here addressed seems to be a human being, another poet, one susceptible to the delights of melancholy rather than to the austere and figure herself.
Do you think that we might be justified in interpreting this poem as being an address direct to the reader?
To the reader, that is, to a certain kind of human being, however, one who would enjoy this particular state of mind.
It may also be to a reader who is assumed to be of the same sensibility as John Keats, and perhaps be, in a way, a kind of soliloquy, a kind of counseling of himself by John Keats.
Well, what is he telling this reader, or what is he telling this poet, or what is he telling himself to do in this first stanza? He uses a great deal of figurative language, full of allusions, on the purely literal level. What is he telling us not to do here?
Well, he's telling us not to run from pain, not to commit suicide. Lethe, of course, is the river of forgetfulness in Hades. And he's telling us first, go not to Lethe, do not seek forgetfulness. He is assuming, of course, that the person knows pain. If a person is having some kind of difficulty that makes him want to, or that causes him problems in being happy in life. And he first says, don't go to Lethe, don't seek forgetfulness.
I notice that he also alludes to a number of other poisons or opiates in this opening stanza. Wolfbane, nightshade, yewberries, all of them conventional symbols of death, and at least one of which is a poison. Is he telling us here then, don't commit suicide?
Well, perhaps that would be stretching the meaning somewhat. That is, do not attempt to deaden this kind of mood, because if you so do with, for example, nor let the beetle was a symbol of the resurrection of the soul, nor the death moth, a moth with markings that resemble the skull. If you do, then you will lose consciousness too rapidly, and you will lose the kind of pleasure which he calls the wakeful anguish. I think to say suicide is perhaps stretching the meaning more than the poet implies.
Yes, I think also that it's possible that what Keats is saying in this opening stanza is that one who is in a melancholy mood is not wise if he surrounds himself with the conventional trappings of melancholy. That is, ordinarily a person who is feeling depressed feels a certain sympathy with the owl and the death moth and yewberries and wolfsbane. And I think that Keats may be saying here that the real connoisseur of melancholy does not surround himself with such extreme symbols of sadness as the owl, the death moth, and so on, because true melancholy does not lie in things that are sad or direful in themselves.
Our basic problem, then, the situation of the person whom he is addressing, is actually brought out, not at all in this stanza, but in the first line of the second stanza. But when the melancholy fit shall fall. So he is telling this person on whom the melancholy fit has fallen. First, do not do these things. Cherish the wakeful anguish of the soul which melancholy has brought to you. Now, perhaps, I wonder, in the words pale forehead, if there is an implication here that the man is a lover, if he knows a lover's case.
Well, that might be mildly supported in the last part of this stanza, yes. But I don't know again that it is meant so specifically. Though the last image, when the melancholy fit does fall suddenly without your knowing it, then, however, you are to surround yourself not with the accompaniments of opiates or death, but rather with a particular kind of beauty, that beauty which is extremely vivid and transient, the morning rose, the salt sand wave, the globed peonies, all of which last but for a moment, and finally, the last example of that which you should feed upon, which suggests, and I think no more than suggests as one possibility, a love affair, which is perhaps not too satisfactory.
Yes, I think here again that we have Keats, the connoisseur of melancholy, then. Just as the true epicure is not a person who stuffs himself with a gross type of food, but is rather one who selects food and savors it to the utmost, who perhaps doesn't eat very much, but who selects the most tasty kind of food. So Keats is saying here that the person who really knows how to make the most of his melancholy does not surround himself with such trappings as death moths, but rather tries to cultivate a particular type of melancholy which he considers the most desirable. And here we have this idea that appears to be quite a strong theme in the poetry of Keats, the idea that beauty and melancholy are inseparable, that there is something quite melancholy about the most beautiful objects in this world. He doesn't say that melancholy and beauty are identical, as he does in Ode on Grecian Urn, say that beauty and truth are identical. He simply implies here, I think, that they are inseparable, and that a person who is in a melancholy mood should cultivate this emotion by looking at a morning rose or a rainbow or a wealth of globed peonies. I think that his choice of the word glut here is interesting, and this word may suggest something else. To glut is to overindulge a particular desire to such an extent that the desire is killed. Do you think that it's possible that what Keats is giving us here is a cure for melancholy? That is he saying that a person who finds himself surrounded by a cloud of melancholy can cure this melancholy fit by glutting his sorrow, by indulging his sorrow to such an extent that the desire is satisfied?
Yes, I think that's true. I don't know that he does really give us the sense of satiety here, of turning to something else after one has glutted himself with melancholy. I get the feeling that he says that the problem isn't one of attempting to get to the point where melancholy becomes something else, save as it remains itself. That the more one gets to enjoy melancholy, the more one gets to enjoy it, the more satisfaction it gives him, but it still does not become something different. He does not want to sell melancholy down the river for anything else.
Yes, I could also see the possibility in that he is here giving a solution for melancholy, but I feel more that he is giving a prescription for the enjoyment of melancholy, the proper connoisseur's enjoyment.
Isn't it also possible that here we have a combination of both ideas? I mentioned before that we know that Keats was familiar with the writings of Burton, The Anatomy of Melancholy, and many of these 17th century writers on the subject of melancholy make clear that overmuch melancholy can lead to madness, that excessive melancholy can lead to suicide. Now here, I think Keats is telling us not to turn to suicide, not to turn to such surroundings as will exaggerate or accentuate this melancholy feeling, but rather to indulge it in such a way as to get the most out of it before the melancholy fit is over.
In fact, am I wrong, Dr. Andrews, when I say that I recall that in 18th century texts, the word hypochondria is used for something equivalent to melancholy, sometimes abbreviated as the hip, H-Y-P.
Oh, that may be true.
And there it is beginning to pick up pejorative connotations. It's beginning to pick up the connotation of something that should be avoided, although, of course, the 17th and 18th century inveighed against anything that was taken too far. They believed very strongly about the importance of not going too far in anything. However, the Romantics came along and then stressed the desirability of going as far as you could in one direction, going to excess, and finding a certain value in going to excess and avoiding the valuable golden mean of the Augustan age.
I wonder here if he isn't alluding, perhaps rather obliquely, to some of the late 18th century writers who certainly did surround themselves with the death moth, the beetle, and the yewberry. I'm thinking in particular, of course, of the so-called graveyard school of poetry, Robert Blair, Edward Young, and, well, even Gray to some extent. And Keats appears to be reacting against this tendency. It's a tendency, of course, which does show up even in 19th century Romanticism, the glorification of melancholy, the glorification of melancholy subjects such as death.
He is suggesting then a different means to the same end.
Yes, I think so.
We notice then that stanzas 1 and 2 can be subsumed under one compound sentence, with the but joining them. And we notice that in reality, to get any sense out of the two, you have to take them together. I'd like to look a little more at the first stanza, and I wonder why he refers to the rosary of yewberries.
I take this to mean the worship of death. The same sort of thing that I just finished commenting upon. The worshiping of the graveyard that we find in late 18th century poetry. The rosary, of course, is a means of counting prayers. The yewberry is a conventional symbol of death.
And then the mournful psyche of the beetle or the death moth are something which someone searches for endlessly, some delightful object of desire, always lost, for which one searches.
Well, the beetle was a symbol of the resurrection of the soul, wasn't it? And the death moth, a particular moth that looked like a human skull, again, symbols of death for which the soul sought.
Yes, of course, the psyche, the soul, was symbolized as a butterfly, and he says here that you shouldn't choose the butterfly that is going to be your psyche to be the death moth, that is a symbol of death.
Then the downy owl, a partner in your sorrow's mysteries. I see here a Faust image. Faust working in his laboratory with the owl, or as it is in Edgar Allan Poe, the raven at his elbow, while he works quietly on the alchemy of sorrow, rather madly and again with a kind of monomania in the cause of this sorrow and in the worship of sorrow.
Yes, of course, the L again is, I think, a fairly conventional symbol for night, and night is a fairly conventional symbol for melancholy. I'm not sure that it's necessary to pin it down to anything much more specific.
Or a sign of death, too, wasn't
yes,
it?
also a sign
I think
of death.
the owl is somehow associated. I may be moving off into Pogo land with Walt Kelly's character Howland Owl, who is pictured as an astrologer, or who wears the hat of an astrologer. But I wonder if the owl doesn't have also some associations of that kind, so that we do get a picture of the person working here on the mysteries of sorrow, like a kind of astrologer in his laboratory. Then I wonder about the line, or about the words shade to shade. What is meant here? For shade to shade will come too drowsily. Does he mean here that the shade of the kind of life that you lived will give way too soon to the shade that is the shade of death? And this time will move too rapidly. In other words, am I implying, or is it possible that here in the poem that he's saying that whereas these poisons above may not confer death necessarily, they will impose upon the person who takes of them, and a person who partakes too much of melancholy, a kind of Hades life on earth, a kind of life in the shade on earth.
Oh, yes, I would quite agree, except that it seems to me that not the rapidity, but rather the lack of consciousness is stressed here, that come to drowsily. Not exactly rapid, but simply that one does not feel the delight of melancholy.
Yes, isn't he saying that if one does glut oneself on the grosser material of melancholy, he will not be able to taste it to the utmost, but will find himself drugged, as it were, and will not be able to enjoy these exquisite emotions of anguish. Again, a theme which is recurrent in Keats' poetry, the similarity between pleasure and pain.
Then we have, in the second stanza, interesting use of paradox. The melancholy fit comes down, sudden from heaven like a weeping cloud that fosters the droop-headed flowers. So the rain, then, causes the flowers' heads to droop for a time with the pressure of the descending rain, but at the same time, the rain brings new life to the flowers. By the same token, it hides the green hill here in an April shroud. It seems to kill it. It seems to wrap it in death. Yet it brings life out of the green hill. And so, whereas melancholy might seem to impose on the individual a kind of shade life, a kind of drugged life, it is something which he should not increase, but it's something which he should take as it is and come to savor this uh, this deadly sense of melancholy and this drugged effect that melancholy has. Is that right?
Yes, I think so. And here, of course, we find a theme which is not original with Keats. It's one which poets have lamented for ages, and that is that beauty and melancholy are inseparable. The very fact that beauty seems to remind the poet that it will not last involves it, links it inseparably with melancholy. As a matter of fact, I think the implication is that some of the most beautiful objects in the world are beautiful largely because of their transient nature. The rainbow, for instance, a beautiful sight, one which we know will pass on very shortly. When beauty, from one point of view at least, when beauty is captured or arrested, then its very commonplace nature makes us accept it without thinking, without savoring it. But on the other hand, a sight which occurs only occasionally and which we realize will pass on is more likely to be savored to the utmost. Isn't it Emerson that said, for instance, that if we were only allowed to see the stars once in 1,000 years, how we would look up at them at amazement at this amazing display, and yet the stars come out every night, and most of us seldom bother to look up at them.
In this particular stanza, there is one line that I would appreciate some discussion, the line, "Or if thy mistress some rich anger shows." In the preceding lines, Keats has said that presented the morning rose as beautiful, the rainbow, and the globed peonies, and here apparently, if I am reading somewhat correctly, the mistress is presented as her most beautiful in a fit of anger rather, that seems to be somewhat continuous. This somewhat surprises me, or I consider it rather unusual presentation of beauty. Does it strike you as that, Dr. Marks?
I'm not sure. I keep getting involved with other parallelisms that are working out here. Perhaps if I go through them, we might be able to I might be able to work toward an answer to your question. The morning rose, of course, will last just for a time. It blooms in the morning, and then presumably the morning will pass and it will be less beautiful than it was then. The rainbow is also quite transient. The globed peony is now at its greatest size and must only decay now. And I wonder if he isn't also saying that if there isn't the reverse paradox in the rich anger that his mistress shows, that also will be soon gone.
But he does see his mistress as most beautiful when she is angry.
Well, I wonder here if what we have isn't a sort of double causation. To start out with, he seems to be addressing someone who is melancholy, for what reason we know not. In general, he says that a person who is melancholy should feed his sorrow on a morning rose, or on a rainbow, or on a cluster of flowers, perhaps. Now, I wonder if he doesn't change the subject slightly and say, "And, young lover, if you are melancholy because of some quarrel with your mistress, you should savor that to the utmost by imprisoning her soft hand and peering into her beautiful eyes. In this way, you can savor the type of melancholy that arises out of a lover's quarrel, perhaps."
That would mean, then, that the semicolon has a distinct point here, that he does shift subject.
Yes, that's the way I interpret the stanza.
Yes, that would mean then that in between the or and the if, we have the word then implied. And when the melancholy fit shall fall, then glut thy sorrow, or if thy mistress some rich anger shows, then imprison her soft hand. And so these two then become parallel. But I think there is an implication here that there is a very definite beauty in the anger.
An intensification of life, then, in anger.
Because there is in Keats this very great ability, and I don't like to use Hollywood premiere adjectives, but he has the ability to be parallel, sometimes in the most unexpected ways, to move his imagery down and always to be saying similar things in ways that are not immediately noticeable as similar. So that the mistress's rich anger, I think, implies that she is red, that her face is red from this, and I like to compare her with the flower above, with the globus peony or the morning rose in her anger. But like the cloud that comes down and makes the flowers droop, and the green hill and shrouds the green hill, this anger comes and provides something new and wonderful for her, something life-giving like rain, although it is in a way also something deadly that usually increases the melancholy of the person whom he is addressing. And I think this is why he's addressing him. He's saying, now usually you'd get melancholy at this point when your mistress showed rich anger. But don't do this. Imprison her soft hands and let her rest deep, deep upon her peerless eyes. And we go back again. Her peerless eyes, and we go back again to the imagery above of the globus peonies and the morning rose, and the same kind of observation of some beautiful spherical object. Then, of course, the word feed ties together with the word glut in the same parallelism. The stanza 3, of course, immediately modifies 2, joins together very closely there, and gives the reasons why you can apply what happens with the mistress to what happens with the flowers.
Yes, in stanza 1, then, we're told what, and in stanza 2, we're told what we should do, and in stanza 3, we're told why we should do it. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die. This, then, is the first real explanation that Keats has given us of why beauty and melancholy are inseparable. That is, it is the knowledge that beauty must pass away. I think if we examine this closely, we will see that the she, of course, refers to melancholy. Melancholy is, in the third stanza, then, being personified. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, and joy, whose hand is ever at his lips bidding adieu, and aching pleasure nigh, turning to poison while the bee-mouth sips. Aye, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine. The she, then, is melancholy. It is melancholy that dwells with beauty. And
my feeling was that the she was the girl whom he has just talked about.
I would have thought melancholy.
I think the fifth line makes clear that it is melancholy. Aye, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine. You see, I think again we have a parallelism here. She dwells with beauty, and she, melancholy, dwells with joy and dwells with aching pleasure.
Do you think, Dr. Andrews, that beauty here is meant simply as all beauty, or does it mean with a particular kind of beauty, beauty that must die, that melancholy dwells with?
Well, of course,
Is that
if we call upon our knowledge of other poems of Keats, we will recall that in the Ode to a Grecian Urn, for instance, he praises the urn because the urn represents a form of beauty, artistic beauty, which Keats says will not die.
I'm interested in the image, and joy whose hand is ever at his lips bidding adieu. This is one of my favorite images, the image of joy, which is a kind of boy who is present with one for a time with some kind of gifts and pleasure, but who is always saying goodbye. Even while he is with you, he is moving away.
Yes, the image, I think, basically is of a person throwing a kiss, isn't it? His hand is at his lips, bidding adieu. And again, I think that the reason that Keats sees something melancholy about joy is that joy is always in the process of passing away. I think we find here the implication of the philosophical idea that there is no such thing as the present, that there is the past and that there is the future. But even in the very process of enjoying something, we can't enjoy it except in retrospect. We can look back on moments that we did enjoy. But the present, after all, is instantaneous, so that actually we only have a memory of joy. And his next image here, of course, is not a personification at all. I think he pictures pleasure as being a beverage of some sort. A beverage which, even as a person sips it, turns to poison. And I think the same idea is implied here. There is a mixture of something sad in the most exquisite pleasure. Notice that he modifies pleasure with the adjective aching, which is ordinarily a term that is reserved for pain. But in Keats, as I previously mentioned, there is frequently the idea brought out that pleasure and pain are very similar, and we'll discover that he describes them in remarkably similar terms.
I'm interested in the word be-mouth used here, meaning that the mouth sips pleasure as if it were nectar, but the nectar turns to poison as the person sips of it.
I think also implied is even that a very tiny sip, the bee mouth, turns to poison. That is, you needn't be glutted necessarily, as he said in stanza 2. But the fact that even a small pleasure has melancholy in it.
Yes, this idea, of course, is emphasized in the following lines. I, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine. Here we have a sort of temple image, as if there were a temple to delight, and right in the middle of this temple is a shrine to veiled melancholy.
Although actually he is counseling here not the way in which melancholy is to be found so close to pleasure, but he is counseling us to search for melancholy and to find how close melancholy is to pleasure and how one can take melancholy and then get some pleasure with it. So whereas it is a sad thing that joy's hand should be always at his lips bidding adieu, and that pleasure should turn to poison while one partakes of it, it is nevertheless a remarkable thing, and it is on this that he builds his poem, that the converse is true, and that he can take melancholy in large doses and get pleasure out of it.
Yes, and I noticed that you say that he can do this. I think, again, that Keats is talking of the connoisseur here. Veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine right in the middle of the temple of delight, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine. Notice we have here a gustatory image, the image of the connoisseur again. The only person who is able to see the melancholy in the center of the temple of delight is the connoisseur, one with fine taste, perhaps a person with a soul kindred to that of Keats.
This implies then one with experience also, fine taste being developed partly by experience. And anyhow here, though seen of none save whose strenuous tongue has almost in the past, and therefore has some experience and knowledge.
Yes, I think it's a cultivated taste, all right. I think Keats would be the first to say that the taste for melancholy is a cultivated taste, and that only a person with this fine taste is able to see the melancholy elements in beauty.
I wonder, too, if the strenuous does not imply here a person who has the strength to find the joy that is in melancholy. It's very difficult, of course, to work out this image of what the joy or what the grape is. But I wonder if melancholy here is not pictured as the hard hull, the skin of the grape, which one breaks to get the joy out of it.
Well, I would have thought the other way around, that the outside is joy and the melancholy the inside.
But that's not what he's talking about through the first stanzas.
Well, here he says, the temple of delight, and inside the temple is the shrine of melancholy. It is the grape of joy, and if you break it, then you see melancholy. That is, at any rate, as I see the lines. Dr. Andrews, do you have an opinion?
Well, yes, I would say literally that he seems to be saying that only the person who is able to get the most out of joy is able to savor the melancholy elements in it. Again, I suppose it's a little dangerous to start imagining what Keats would have said, but my guess is that Keats would have said that there is nothing very melancholy about the most superficial types of pleasures, that only the person who is able to enjoy pleasure to the utmost is able to taste the melancholy elements within joy's grape.
Yes, but there's so little about pleasure. The second stanza, of course, does talk about the morning rose, but he talks about glutting the sorrow on the morning rose, and on the rainbow, and on the wealth of globed peonies. Now, are we saying here then that he is actually concentrating on the joy in these things or the melancholy in these things?
Well, I think again that the two are inseparable, but in the third stanza, Keats appears to be saying that there is an element of melancholy in everything that is beauty, that is beautiful, if we can just find it. There is only the connoisseur can savor the melancholy, but there is a melancholy element in beauty, in joy, in pleasure, and in delight, although the only person who can taste the melancholy is the one who is able to enjoy the pleasure to the utmost, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine.
his soul shall taste the sadness of her might and be among her cloudy trophies hung.
We have an interesting figure then here at the end. We are back to the shrine of melancholy, which, as I see it, is something like the shrines of the Diana and Venus in Chaucer's Knight's Tale. They are the shrines to which the warriors come and ask for the assistance of these goddesses, perhaps, and hanging around the shrine are the trophies of other warriors who have fought for the goddess. And he's saying here then that this person who truly is able to savor the juxtaposition of melancholy and joy will be held high by the goddess melancholy, will be valued by the goddess melancholy, and thereafter will be remembered by devotees who come to the shrine of melancholy to worship.
4 poems by John Keats. Discussing these poems are Professor Jean Andrews, Professor Alfred Marks, and Professor Ethel-Mae Haave.
Ode to a Nightingale. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past, and lethewards had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thy happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beechen green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and provincial song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou amongst the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last gray hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy, though the dull brain perplexes and retards. Already with thee, tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. But here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn, and the pastoral eglantine, fast-fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now, more than ever, seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The same that oft-times hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairylands forlorn. Forlorn. The very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul's self. Adieu. The fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu. Thy plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? In the opening stanza of this poem, I think we'll discover that Keats is employing one of his favorite devices. That is, I think he's trying to charm the reader into relaxing, into suspending his critical faculties, as it were, by inducing a sort of hypnotic spell. And I think this is exactly what he accomplishes in the poem. In describing his own drugged, semi-hypnotic state, I think that the reader sympathizes, and I use the word in its original sense. I think the reader sympathizes with the poet to such an extent that he relaxes and is left more or less at the mercy of the poet. That is, the poet discovers from here on out that once having induced this spell, the reader is much more receptive to suggestions.
The poem also sets up the, intellectually then, the problem of a kind of numbness brought on the poet, somewhat similar to what it is in Ode on Melancholy, which is compared with what might be the result of a drink of some kind of opiate, or of the kind of opiate effect that there might be in reasonable doses of a kind of poison. And he again uses the word lethe, as he does in Ode on Melancholy, to give this kind of forgetfulness that he receives from the opiate or the poison. And again, as he does in Melancholy, sees this kind of fit, this kind of drunkenness, this kind of drugged quality as being brought about by joy. And so as he knows joy from listening to the nightingale, through envy of the happy lot of the nightingale, or being too happy in the joy of the nightingale, he knows this drugged sense.
Yes, I think that most readers who approach this poem for the first time are rather surprised to find that Keats is describing a state of happiness here, because ordinarily the terms that he employs are terms that we associate with pain. Such words as aches and numbness, hemlock, opiate, leafy words, are words that are ordinarily used in quite a different context, so that I think it usually comes as somewhat of a surprise to discover about halfway through this first stanza that Keats is trying to describe an emotion of happiness.
Well, if so, it would seem to me to be rather unusual happiness. The cause, he says, is happiness, being too happy, but the state that he describes is one of drowsiness, and in that sense happiness, yes, but that's as far as I would go along.
Well, I think again, though, that what Keats is that one of the ideas that he's implying here is that pleasure and pain are so closely related that the symptoms are almost identical. And in a great deal of Keats's other poetry, we discover that he describes pleasure in terms of pain quite commonly.
The result here, though, is a deadening of sensation. Would you not agree?
Yes, a deadening, a rather pleasant deadening,
yes, pleasant.
However.
Although it is always important to read more of a poet in order to understand him, sometimes the best way to learn to read poetry is to read a lot of poetry. And sometimes the best way to learn to read any one poem by a man is to read more poems by the man and then come back to it, this kind of lifting oneself up by one's own bootstraps. But would you not say here, Dr. Andrews, that a reading of Ode on Melancholy is very important to the person who wants to understand the first stanza here of Ode to a Nightingale?
Yes, certainly we find the same theme running throughout both poems, I think, and that would be a key poem to the understanding of Ode to a Nightingale. At the end of this first stanza, I think, again, we see one of the characteristics, qualities in Keats' poetry, and this is his sensuousness. I say we see the beginning of it in this stanza. The idea is really developed in the following stanza. But when, for instance, he describes the nightingale as being a light-winged dryad of the trees in some melodious plot of beechen green in shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease, I think that it's interesting to see what a very complex emotional reaction Keats is striving to produce here. Notice that we have the auditory image, the melodious plot of beechen green, the visual image, that is the greenness of the meadow, the shadows of the meadow, blended together in such a way that we get one rather complex reaction from this image. I think this idea is developed, of course, at much greater length. We see the same technique being employed in the second stanza of this poem, where he describes the wine that he longs for. In this passage, we have an appeal to the gustatory sense. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth. Here again, I suppose, an appeal to the tactile sense. Tasting of flora in the country green, dance and Provençal song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple-stained mouth. We can see that in this description of the wine, which ordinarily we think of as appealing to the sense of taste alone, Keats manages to work up a very complex description in which he appeals not just to the taste, but to the eye, to a certain extent, I think, even to the ear, in the beaded bubbles winking at the mouth.
And in this second stanza, he seems to be setting up a contrast between the opiate of the first stanza and the wine of the second stanza. He is overcome by the song of the nightingale as if it were an opiate that he had drunk through the song of the nightingale. And here he says, "Oh, for a draught of vintage that I might drink and leave the world unseen." So he then describes the vintage that he would like to have in order that he can somehow appreciate firsthand the song and the attitude of the nightingale instead of secondhand, which produces a drugged effect on him.
What he seems to be describing here, rather than wine, indeed, is a different civilization. In stanza 1, he said that the nightingale singest of summer, and so here, as he describes the wine, what he seems to be describing actually is a pastoral civilization, suggested, of course, Provençal song with troubadours, South France, world of life and sun and happiness, not ecstatic happiness, but very pleasant. As you say, here he is trying to induce a state of positive, he is reaching for positive pleasure in a sense, as opposed to the opiate of stanza 1 for the same effect, it seems to me.
And he wants to really inhabit the world of the nightingale. The nightingale is called a dryad here, of course, referring to some creature of a tree, a creature who lives inside a tree. I hope I'm not confusing the dryad with the hamadryad. I don't know whether a dryad or a hamadryad is a half a dryad, like as a sphere, or as a hemisphere is a half a sphere. I think I am simply dealing in fractured English or fractured Greek at that rate. But we have throughout the association of a pastoral world again, of Keats's reference to pastoral myth and the way in which he brings pastoral myth in for his imagery. And he combines this, as you very nicely brought out, Dr. Haave, with the Provençal song and with the sense of the romance, of the romantic civilizations of Languedoc and of the medieval France.
Yes, I think for the student who's interested in examining the stuff of which poetry is made, that this stanza provides an excellent example. Oh, for a draught of vintage. Now, of course, I think that this is poetic language, that we would seldom find anyone today requesting of a head waiter a draught of vintage. You would be more likely to ask for a glass of wine or possibly a drink of wine. A draught, of course, is, on the literal level, simply a drink. I think the term draught has a more interesting connotation, however. Draught implies a rather long drink. The word vintage also shows us an interesting choice of words. Vintage means wine. On the other hand, it is a word that we associate with fine, old wines. We would never think of asking for a modern, domestic, commercial wine by the name vintage. So that by employing these terms that are rich in connotations, Keats manages to build up a richness in this stanza that couldn't be done with more prosaic words.
The archaic word draught, too, is still used in connection with beer, draft beer, and I think there's a sense there in the word draft of something that does not come out of a bottle, but that comes out of a barrel, or perhaps a large a pipe or hogshead or tune. And this, of course, is brought out in the second line, and I think you were coming to that.
Yes, I think that Keats's enumeration here is not entirely logical, but is based upon association, perhaps, rather than logic. I think that the term vintage suggests to him a wine cellar full of hogsheads of wine, and
yes,
that, for he does mention that it's to be cooled a long age in the deep-delved earth. I think this is a direct allusion to the wine cellar. Now, to study the transition from one image to the next, I think, is an interesting exercise. His mention of the earth reminds him of flowers, of the god of the flowers, flora, tasting of flora. The flowers, of course, remind him of the country green. And now then we have a country, a pastoral scene, which suggests to him perhaps some sort of village festival, dance, and then next dancing suggests singing to him. And then the next transition perhaps is a little more complex, and the uninitiated might well ask with a great deal of logic, but perhaps not too much understanding of poetry, what kind of mirth is sunburnt mirth? Here we find the poet certainly using his poetic license. I think the meaning, however, is clear enough. The mention of dancing and singing has suggested to him the peasants, perhaps, the country people who are sunburned from their labors in the sun and who are at this time apparently celebrating at some sort of village festival.
Naturally and healthily gay.
Yes.
I keep trying to work out a kind of wine pressing party here or something of the sort, and think of the sunburnt as being the sunburnt girls who tread on the grapes. However, I'm afraid that this I can't justify denotatively, and in a way it might seem to be to violate the sense of those first two lines. At any rate, we see in the full of the true, the blushful Hippocrene, that he is talking about a wine in a very general sense, because he is here using the fluid that comes from the well of the Muses. And he then seems to think of this vintage as being something that provides one with beauty in the highest sense.
Oh, do you think, Dr. Andrews, that he was reminded of Hippocrene because of Provençal song? That is, the fountain was said to inspire poets, and Provençal song is a rather fine kind of poetry.
Yes, I think unquestionably the reference to Provence is suggested not only by the discussion of wine, but also because of the other connotations of Provence with the medieval troubadours and so on. I think that his description of the wine as being a beaker full of the warm south gives us an interesting paradox. We've already seen that in the second line of the second stanza, he has asked for a wine that has been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth. So here Keats then, I think, is acutely conscious of the fact that it's possible for a wine to be cool and warm at the same time. An interesting awareness of sensation, I think. Cool as far as its temperature is concerned, and warm in that perhaps it warms the throat as one drinks it.
This is perhaps another reason why perhaps my notion might be slightly supported, that there is a movement out of the drinking of the wine in the cold cellar to perhaps the freshly pressed juice in the at the place of the pressing of the wine.
Why is the Hippocrene described here as being blushful?
I think he is again using a word like purple. I think also because to me the Hippocrene is clear, and this Hippocrene is not. So he uses a quite delicate word to express the fact that this Hippocrene is in a way very far from being clear.
Yes, perhaps a rose, one would be inclined to think that he was describing a rose wine of some sort from the term blushful, were it not that a little later he mentions the purple-stained mouth. This is another use of poetic license, as I see it. He describes the beaker as full of the true, the blushful Hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim. It's clear enough that it's the beaker that has the beaded bubbles winking at the brim, and purple-stained mouth. Now, I know that it's possible to speak of the mouth of a goblet, and it may be that Keats wants the reader to see the purple stain around the mouth of the goblet. For some reason or another, I think most readers tend to see the purple stain around the mouth of the person who's drinking the wine. Do you think that perhaps he had this in mind?
We would like to grant him this, and certainly Keats is a man who can be granted a great deal.
I admit that I had always taken the purple stained as the mouth of the drinker. Certainly.
Although I think you will agree, won't you, that logically, syntactically, this isn't what Keats is saying.
Syntactically, logically, well, would a glass have a purple stain? Might, possibly, from wine. Yes.
It certainly could from lipstick.
From lipstick, but wine doesn't have the adhesive quality.
Depends on one's knowledge of wine.
I suppose that, on the other hand, that the syntax here is just as logical as Keats's sunburnt mirth is in an earlier line in the same stanza. Notice how very lovingly Keats lingers over the description of this wine, how leisurely he lingers over this. I think this, again, is in perfect keeping with the mood which has been set in the first stanza of the poem. This is not a man who is anxious to go somewhere. He is very leisurely entertaining these ideas, and in a style which is peculiarly Keats' own, I think, he manages to extract every possible emotion and sensation from his description before he decides to move on. For it is only in the last two lines of this stanza that Keats completes his description of the wine and tells us why he wants the wine. That I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim.
The third stanza, then, continues the last two lines of the second stanza. And with thee fade away into the forest dim, then a colon, fade far away. I would like to drink and then fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou among the leaves hast never known. These things about the difficult world, the weariness that one must know, and the fever and the fret, and these many things that man must bear he would like to somehow get away from with the nightingale and with the kind of artistic intoxication afforded him by the draught of vintage that he describes in stanza 2.
Yes, he gives us anything but an attractive description of the prosaic world that he feels he must live in most of the time. The weariness, the fever, and the fret here where men sit and hear each other groan. A rather pessimistic view of life, a place where men sit and hear each other groan. I suspect also that in the fifth line of the poem here, when he speaks of where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, he may have had in mind the death of his brother Tom at this point. Although, again, I'm not sure to what extent a person is justified in bringing in biographical material in a poem, which, after all, should be an artistic unity in itself.
Then there's the interesting pair of lines on love, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow, where there is the meaning that on the one hand beauty must age, and on the other hand beauty, like the woman in John Donne's song who must be unfaithful, beauty must be woman in John Donne's song who must be unfaithful, beauty must lose the lustrous eyes of love after a few days, or new love pineth them beyond tomorrow, and even new love must become sated with beauty.
This stanza, then, presents a rather dismal portrait of reality, and one can quite well see why he wishes to escape such a world, which, since he just about covers all the possibilities, illness, age, youth, where but to think, only to think, is to be full of sorrow, and one wonders action then necessarily would lead to disaster. Beauty does not last, love cannot. However, in the next stanza, he suggests a possibly better means of escaping, and it's a rather ironic one, I think. For I would fly to thee, that is, to the world of the nightingale, not charioted by Bacchus, not charioted by wine, but an artificial help, even this artificial help which he presents so imaginatively, but on the immaterial wings of imagination, poesy, and then, ironically, the state of lethargy that he has put himself into deters this method of abstracting himself from reality, that the dull brain perplexes and retards, and I find that a little nicely ironic note here.
Yes, I think it's interesting to see that the second and the third stanzas here do represent a sort of false start. He entertains an idea, entertains one means of escaping the world into the imaginative world of the nightingale, and then rejects this plan as being altogether unsuitable, and elects another plan instead.
I wonder, however, if he is not simply clarifying what he said in stanza 2. I wonder if in this stanza he is showing that he does not want Flora and the dance and Provençal song, or whether he means specifically by this that he's not going to find this by way of drinking intoxicated spirits.
Well, even in stanza 2, it seemed to me that he did not stress the wine very strongly. What he actually discusses, the bulk of the poem, is a kind of life, which is that of southern France, that would cause him to bridge the gap into another world.
Well, he's saying here in 4, he's not saying what he wants to be charioted to. He is only saying here what he does not want to be charioted by. And so when he says not charioted by Bacchus and his parts, he's making it clear that he does not want a specific wine, a specific vintage, a specific liquid vintage as such. And I think we've already discussed how in 2 there is a meaning in connection with Provençal song, and Hippocrene, there is a meaning that his vintage is a kind of artistic vintage. And here he makes it clear then that this is what he wants to drink.
Yes, I think that this is an important point, that Keats is not saying that he wants to become intoxicated in order to escape reality, that he asked only for a draft of vintage when he was considering that possibility. And it's largely because of the associations of this vintage that he wants a draft of vintage. However, he, in stanza 4, has decided to try to escape to the world of the nightingale by means of poetry, and almost instantaneously he discovers that he is in that world. That is, once the idea occurs to him, he is already with thee, he addresses the nightingale. Tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. Now, what is this world of the nightingale into which he is trying to escape? What type of world is it? What is it about this world that he finds so attractive? Is it merely the fact that it is a world that is free from the weariness, the fever, and the fret, here where men sit and hear each other groan?
Oh, no, it has its very positive virtues. It's a land referring, of course, to literature, the queen moon on her throne, clustered around. It's a dark world, dusky world, rather, but here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown, a comfortable, comforting place, verdurous glooms, which, however, are very pleasurable. And then you move into the next stanza to the fact that it is a place of very sensuous and luxurious nature, and the description here is largely of nature, flower imagery. Again, as is perhaps characteristic of Keats, there is some stress in this stanza that many of the beauties are, however, transient and do not last long.
Yes, I also find in this stanza an excellent example of the sort of complex sensory reaction that I previously mentioned in connection with the wine. It's hard to think of a single sensory perception which is not appealed to here. We have the warmth of the setting, the sweetness of the setting, an appeal to the sense of color perception, and then finally in the next to the last line, the musk rose is full of dewy wine, and the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves again appeals to the auditory sense. So that here I think it's interesting to discover what a complex thing poetry is. I think the embryonic poet in any sort of descriptive passage is likely to limit himself to an appeal to one sense alone. That is, if he's describing flowers, he is likely to limit himself to the appearance of the flowers. Now, in this passage, we see that Keats is describing a scene from nature, but that not only does he describe the appearance of the flowers, the grass, the hawthorn, and so on, he describes the feeling that one gets when he's in that setting. He describes, or at least
I think, implies something of the smell that one experiences in this setting, and even manages to appeal to the sense of taste, all in the same passage, so that the accomplished poet then is able to wring from this scene every bit of sensation, every emotion possible before he leaves it.
I wonder if the reason he is dealing in so many senses here is that he has, in a sense, come into this scene blindfolded. He says that he wants to go on the viewless wings of poesy, and if by this I wonder if he means that the poem is not a painting, it is not a kind of photography, and of course he wrote before the invention of the photograph, that the poem is essentially something in which the reader is actually imagining the existence of things which he is not able to see, to which he is blind. So then, perhaps for this reason, the imagery that he uses in stanza 5 is so varied and emphasizes other senses than the visual sense.
What do you think he means by the phrase embalmed darkness? In what sense is the darkness here embalmed?
Pleasant, soothing. Balm being something to soothe one.
I was just wondering if your reaction was the same as mine here. The word embalmed implies a sort of warmth and also a sweetness of smell to me. Do you get the same suggestion from it?
Well, I think for our modern reader, we have to say here that it does not mean that darkness has been drained of its blood and had an infusion of embalming fluid placed in it so that it can better retain its tissue in the grave or something of this sort. I think that clearly he means that a kind of balm has been placed over it. I don't know, though. I think my sense of a balm is that of a kind of oily, greasy substance which prevents air from coming in, so the darkness is rather heavy with these flowers, with the scent of these flowers, which shrouds one, although I shouldn't use that word because it brings up the other connotations that I've tried to keep out, but which keeps one at one's distance from fresh air and from sharp noises of the outside world.
Yes, I would certainly agree that one does get the sense of an almost oppressively sweet odor and heaviness of atmosphere in this particular passage.
But I would agree with Dr. Marks, a heavy atmosphere that deters distracting sensations from the outside, protecting one rather, something that, for example, stifles a noise from the outside. There is no noise from the outside here, but that would, as in a very warm night in which the air seems very thick and noise comes muffled only from a distance.
And I think this is what he's doing with the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eve. There's the noise of the flies, but notice he doesn't use the word buzz here. The word is haunt. The word comes at him, the buzz of the flies comes at him muffled and blunt and partaking greatly of the softness of the summer evening.
Yes, the word murmurous is a key word. I think also that the word incense is a key word in this passage. He doesn't speak of the smell of the flowers. He doesn't even speak of the perfume of the flowers. But I think the very use of this word incense suggests a very heavy, almost oppressively sweet smell.
The Ball State Library of Explication Tapes. The following discussion of literature is one of a series made possible through a Lilly Endowment grant. The award was made by the Committee on Foundation Grants of the Association of College and Research Libraries, a division of the American Library Association. These grants are for the purpose of promoting more extensive and imaginative use of library resources by undergraduate students. Unless otherwise specified, the panelists are members of the English Department of Ball State Teachers College. 4 poems by John Keats. Discussing these poems are Professor Jean Andrews, Professor Alfred Marks, and Professor Ethel-Mae Haave.
Now, after lingering then with loving care over this beautiful scene in which Keats enjoys to the fullest every sensation which one can wring from this scene, I think he moves on and introduces a new theme in the next stanza. Here he expresses what one might call the death wish. Why, Dr. Haave, does the poet, in the midst of this beautiful setting, feel the desire to die?
Well, some people associate ideas by likeness and some by contrast, and here possibly it is the contrast. He has just given us a portrait of what he considers an ideal kind of life, and it reminds him perhaps of another kind of ideal, which, however, is the opposite. He would feel like dying now because he has portrayed to himself, or has before him, a scene of ecstasy, of extreme beauty, and it therefore seems an appropriate time for another kind of beauty. Wouldn't you say, Dr.
I wonder if this is along the same subject, however, as stanza 5. He has already drawn a contrast between the world of stanza 2, for which he wishes a draught of vintage, and then in 5 he dreams about this kind of world in which one cannot see, where one only knows these faint or strong odors here in the darkness. And I think there's a sense of contiguity, as it were, which permits him to run now immediately into the notion of death. And I think that stanza 5 has, in a way, certain of the qualities that he attributes to easeful death.
We've already seen that a very common theme in Keats is the desire to capture beauty forever through the medium of art. I wonder here if we don't have a similar theme, namely the desire to capture beauty forever through the medium of death. We sometimes hear of soldiers saying that they would like to die with their boots on. The boot, of course, being a symbol of the military profession. I wonder here if Keats isn't saying that just as it is appropriate for a soldier to die in battle, it is likewise appropriate for a poet to die during some experience which is marked by extreme beauty. In short, this is the most ecstatic state that Keats can imagine, and consequently he says that this would be a fitting time for a poet who deals with beauty, of course, to die.
And who also has thought about death before.
Yes.
Then the last line, "To thy high requiem become a sod," makes the song of the nightingale into a requiem piece that it is singing. But it also brings up the difficulty here that the poet is emphasizing that once having died, the beauty of the act of his death at this time will cease, and then he has become a sod. He is no longer doing or acting in the cause of beauty, and the bird goes on alone.
Yes, of course, here I think we have
again, Keats's poem developing by means of association this idea that the singing of the bird will be a funeral song, or would be a funeral song for the poet himself, then I think suggests the idea that the bird himself is immortal, which is the theme which is introduced in the next stanza. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, no hungry generations tread thee down. This is a line that some, or an idea rather, that some critics have found to be rather fallacious, or not sound at the very least. Some critics have pointed out, for instance, that the bird is not immortal in any sense other than the poet himself might be said to be immortal. Do you find the idea objectionable, Dr.
No, I don't find it objectionable at all. It seems to me that here you move rather readily from one nightingale to an abstract nightingale, eternal beauty, in some respects, which goes on after the death of any individual. Here, the poet John Keats. I see no particular difficulty in making such an association between the individual and the abstract.
It is interesting to notice here that he capitalizes bird. Earlier, he saw fit, I believe, to refer to the nightingale with a small n, and here the capitalization, I think, makes the bird into some abstract, higher quality of eternal music, as it were. And I think certainly in the third and fourth lines, the voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown, means that the nightingale has become the symbol of all nightingales, and particularly the song of all nightingales.
Yes, I think it is true that certainly from the point of view of a poet, the nightingale doesn't have an individual existence. That is, it is simply the nightingale, and whether one hears the nightingale on one side of the earth or the other, one thinks of it nevertheless as being simply the song of the nightingale.
Certainly to the average auditor, all nightingales seem alike, I would think, whereas all human beings do not.
We still have difficulty, however, with this word, no hungry generations, and I wonder about the ease of transition that he has made. I don't think there is any sense that any hungry generations have trod down John Keats. But the implication here is that the hungry generations have, and that hungry generations do not trod him down. Now, are we to think of hungry here as meaning simply the hungriness of time? And is hungry generations abstract time, or does it symbolize the kind of battle for economic existence on the part of generations of mankind?
I myself would be inclined to interpret this as simply time, abstract time, or perhaps death. That is, the transitory nature of human existence, again, is a fairly common theme in poetry. The fact that man must die in order to make room for the next generation is one that I think we find presented here. Again, this, I think, depends entirely upon one's point of view toward the bird, the immortal bird. I think Keats here really is asking us to grant him a little poetic license when he insists upon the immortality of the bird as distinguished from the mortality of man. Obviously, this is a type of conceit. He is asking us to believe, for purposes of poetic faith at least, that this is one bird which has been singing throughout history, and that he is immortal, whereas the individual human being must die and pass away.
The image then moves to the comparison of the song with the song that Ruth might have heard when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The image then moves, does it not, to something other than the song heard by emperor and clown. Here it picks up other meanings, does it not?
Yes, I think it's interesting here that obviously what Keats is trying to do is to enrich the song of the nightingale here. He's trying to show us all of the rich associations that this song has for him. The associations with the ancient days of emperor and clown might suggest for some the medieval period, or possibly even the Roman period. And in the next lines, he, by means of a biblical allusion, reminds us of the plaintive, melancholy, lonely quality of this song also, by alluding to the story of Ruth in the Bible, of course, who, when her husband died, was left alone in a strange country.
There is then, too, in the words charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas and fairy lands forlorn, a kind of drawing together of several ideas brought into the stanza. You have first the magic casements, this magical, wonderful quality of the song, but then he moves to opening on the foam of perilous seas, which carries us into the strange world that Ruth is inhabiting here, away from home, while she is gleaning the sheaves before she met Boaz, was it, who became her husband, in fairy lands forlorn. And this is to the bucolic side of Keats, an unusual alliteration where fairy is alliterated with forlorn, and the fairy world is no longer joyful or pleasant or exactly the kind of place that one would long to go to.
I think these last three lines of this particular stanza have often been praised as containing the very quintessence of Romanticism, and it is interesting, I think, to examine the diction that Keats employs in these three lines to see how he has deliberately chosen words for their connotative values. Here, the use of the word casement, I think, is interesting. Denotatively, a casement is simply a window, but by employing the word casement instead of window, I think that Keats manages to draw for the reader a picture of a large window, a window which perhaps was even contained stained glass. In short, the type of window that we might find in a medieval castle or in some story of romance.
Or in Keats' own Eve of St. Agnes.
Yes, exactly. And in the last line of this same stanza, his use of the word fairy, you'll notice that Keats spells this word F-A-E-R-Y. In one of the earlier drafts of this poem, Keats spelled the word F-A-I-R-Y, and later changed the spelling, I think, quite significantly. The word F-A-I-R-Y, I think, usually brings to mind those tiny elf-like creatures such as Shakespeare describes in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Here, obviously, Keats does not want us to think of anything as delicate and charming as these creatures. And by the change in spelling here, I think Keats brings to mind simply something supernatural and far away. At least this is the distinction that I always make between the two types of fairies.
Maybe I was being inaccurate when I mentioned pastoral Arcadian times in connection with the word fairy. I think, however, this association might be there but I think also with Faery, I always find it quite easy to think of that queen of the fairies, rather, or that sorceress known as Morgane la Fay, and to think of her here creating the kind of world that she brought into existence and that Merlin brought into existence for King Arthur and King Arthur's court.
So then, in this particular stanza, by association, the poet has substantiated his idea that the bird here, the nightingale, is an immortal creature who has existed at various times and is connected with both romance, mystery, and some degree of sadness. And then I think the transition to the last stanza here is an extremely interesting one indeed, and a bit ironic, perhaps.
Yes, I think it is quite definitely ironic that in his very effort to escape from the sadness of and the trouble of the world in which, of the actual world in which the poet has found himself, by taking off on a flight of the imagination, Keats begins a train of thought which results in his using a word forlorn which ironically reminds him of his own state.
So he comes back to himself, and he makes it clear that in a way that he's been coming back to himself throughout the seventh stanza, ever so slowly moving back to his own case. And he says that the word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul's self, and then says, adieu, the fancy cannot cheat so well as she is fain to do, deceiving elf. And he is saying that in a way the fancy is falling short for him. It has not succeeded in taking him completely away from the world as he would like it to do, and perhaps is saying also that the Song of the Nightingale has failed to carry out completely the kind of mission that he hoped it could fulfill.
I wonder here if Keats hasn't come to the conclusion that I think a number of poets have reached, that such an experience, such an ecstatic experience as the one that he's just described for us, is by its very nature one that cannot last for long, that it is a peak of excitement. And of course we know extreme joy only by contrast with its opposite and so on. And here he has described a peak of excitement which obviously cannot endure forever. And actually I think that this is what we have in this poem, largely, a poet trying to describe for us an ecstatic experience which he had, which is momentary and which then passes.
But he had expected it not to, he says, as she is famed to do, as she is supposed to or thought to, and for him that has not been true.
Yes.
We have him then beginning to enter some criticism against the fancy and against the insubstantiality and the way in which the spell of the nightingale fades away, but I think toward the end of the poem he will reassert the value of the nightingale song. He says, adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows o'er the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. And then ask the question, was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? And now he presents the problem as to whether he is now awakening from a dream or whether he has been in the reality and is now, while he seems to be awakening, sleeping. It's the same paradox that we have stated at the end of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, only not with the same irony.
Yes, I think this is true. I'm interested in the last stanza.
as a study in the way in which the poet manages to withdraw from the spell. His entrance into this realm of the nightingale was built up quite leisurely, and we see the poet at the beginning of the poem gradually losing himself in the spell of the nightingale, gradually moving into this realm of the imagination until, by the time we get to stanza 5, let's say, I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, he actually seems to be in another country, so to speak, in another realm. And in this last stanza, I think Keats manages to withdraw from the spell very effectively. He withdraws, of course, as the sound of the nightingale fades away. Adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis very deep in the next valley glades. That is, I think the poet was confronted with quite a problem. He would shatter his mood too abruptly if he suddenly realized, if he suddenly awoke from his vision. But here I think he manages to withdraw from this realm of the imagination that he's been describing very gradually, as one might slowly awaken from a sleep.
And it is interesting to notice here that he says at the end of stanza 2 that he would like to take the drink, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. And we have then, in the disappearing song of the bird here, the sense that the bird is going off into the forest, into the next valley glades. And we are then given to understand that Keats is not going with him, but has left him behind.
I think we ought to note that the mood at the end, the do I wake or sleep, returns very well to approximately the mood at the beginning. My heart aches and drowsy numbness pains, but it is not exactly the same kind of drowsiness or lethargy at all. The conclusion is the philosophical conclusion which you have reached by a long development in the middle, but it does, in a very nice, constructive way, approximate the beginning. That is, it is like a development in a sonata. You end on the major chord again, but with the difference that is accomplished by a development.